So good afternoon. Thank you for
afternoon.
joining us today at the Hong Kong Young Writers Awards.
Well, to introduce myself, my name is Jason Wordie. A little bit on my own background, which is perhaps why I'm able to talk a little bit about what I do talk about and what I do. I read history at Hong Kong University, what feels like now 100,000 years ago, but wasn't quite as long ago as all of that, focusing principally on Hong Kong with some China and some Southeast Asia and some Japan. And having finished at Hong Kong U, again a very long time ago, I decided I didn't want to go into full-time or indeed professional academia, being temperamentally a bit unsuited for that. What I wanted to do was write, and I'd always wanted to do that. So what I wanted and needed to do was find a means by which I was able to do my own writing and focus on that and do what I wanted. So taking out walks was something that started when I was at Hong Kong U with a couple of groups, and it gradually developed on from there. And from that, I also have a newspaper column. I've had that in a number of guises for about 15 years. And I also do lecture from time to time for various corporate groups and other bodies. But that does make me a little bit difficult to define or self-define, in that I have a history background, so I guess you would call me an historian. But I'm not an academic, but I do lecture from time to time. And I've had the newspaper column for years, so that's literally hundreds of thousands of published words in journalism, but I've never worked a day in a newspaper office in my life, so in that sense I'm not a journalist. And then I take out the walks, but these are really orientated toward people who live in Hong Kong. Occasional visitors might find something from them, but overwhelmingly they're orientated toward people who live here. So I take out the walks, but I'm not a tour guide, so I'm kind of defined by not, I suppose.
What or who inspired you to become a writer, and what made you decide on this career path?
Well, what and who inspired me to be a writer? I'd always wanted to write since I was very young, and I'd really started doing that as a teenager and had freelanced various bits and pieces at various times. It really only started to take off professionally when I was at Hong Kong U, because the first book I was out was a co-authored work on Hong Kong's battlefields and wartime sites. That was out in 1996, so I was kind of moving in that direction. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Who was an inspiration for this? Now you're really asking me. A couple of rather good school teachers who had said, no, you're good at this, do that. Other authors who I'd read and quite liked. One in particular who I imagine was something of an influence upon me, though I only met her once and it was only for an hour or so, was Han Yen, because she had written extensively on Hong Kong and China, and a couple of her books I had read before I came to live here. And I always enjoyed her books and still do. And yes, I suppose one probably could say Han Yen was a little bit of an inspiration.
That's great. So how much preparation usually goes in before you do your walks?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, because with my walks in Macau, of course that was the most recent book, that one, and I mentioned that one because with that, the slightly jokey line I always use to people is that represented 25 years reading and 6 years writing, which is about true. So to answer your question with that, how much preparation? Well, I mean, I've lived in Hong Kong for, nudging 30 years, so getting on for that. So really the reading, walking about, I continue to learn things. I mean, every day I look at something, it's that or this, or I read some more. So yeah, there's quite a lot to add on.
That's great. So do you usually write the scripts for your walks?
Oh, well, I don't talk from the script. I talk out of my head. No, this is the whole thing. I mean, the script is an internal one, as far as a script goes. And if I'm in a particular area, like say in Central, for example, now what I'll bring in there is aspects of economic development, social, cultural, the military imprint at the very beginning, stories of land reclamation, land policy, business house development, all sorts of things. That's in Central. If we went over to Tsim Sha Tsui, the role of the army, the role of reclamation, a little bit on piracy and policing, there are all sorts of things. If we went up to Kowloon City, you go back to the time of the Song dynasty, the Song and the Mongols. So there's a lot of connection, and really a script, if you will, is an internal one. I have a broad idea of what I'm going to cover in a particular area, but then linked into that, there are questions that you get asked, and very often the script, shall we say, varies depending on the questions I get or the level of information that people have. That's one of the reasons why I tend not to take out tourists, but like to have people who live here, because they've got an internalised level of knowledge, even if it's a grab bag of urban myths and things like that. People will say, oh, it wasn't like that, it was like that, oh, I get it now. Whereas a visitor will just ask something completely remote. So yes, the short answer to that is I do write my scripts, but I don't pen them out, they just come from within.
That's great. Could you tell us about your experiences while researching your books and your walks?
Now, let me see, what experiences in particular would you like to know?
What inspired you to write about Hong Kong and the general area in particular?
Well, the inspiration to write about Hong Kong was brought about by the fact that I live here. And from the moment I came to live here, I was interested in it. I was in fact interested before I came to live here. So as time went on, I wanted to know more and find out more. So it kind of feeds one upon itself. You read more, then you want to know more, you want to discuss more and learn more. So that was that. Experiences, well, it's all been rather an adventure, because you delve in a library and you read books and you talk to people and you find all manner of information in various corners. So I guess those are experiences one could look at. Something else.
That's great. Is there anything in particular, say like the culture or the cuisine, that you found particularly interesting?
In Hong Kong? Well, I mean, the broader culture is fascinating, because the thing with Hong Kong is it's impossible to be bored here. There's always something of interest here. And as time has gone on, what's particularly interested me have been Southeast Asian connections. A research interest that's developed as time has gone on has been connections really between here and Malaysia, or particularly here in Malaya, as was. Because if we go back into the late 40s and through the 50s, there were very, very close connections between the two places, particularly politically. So that's always interested me. And I'd spent time when I was 19, 20, 21 down in that part of the world, much of that time in Malaysia. So it's quite an interesting thing as it really coalesces back toward where I am now. So those are good things. So those are aspects of fun and interest, I suppose.
That's great. Could you share any particular highlights during one of your walks that you found memorable?
Now, highlights. They're all fun, I must say. Though the thing is, I was doing a walk this morning in Central. And Central is a good place to do an exploration, because it's an area people think they know, but actually they don't really. So a highlight of that for me is, in some ways, I'm a frustrated lecturer. I like lecturing, but I'm not interested in students or tutorials or marking or politics or any of that kind of stuff. But I like giving forward information. And you can really see in an area like that, it's an area that people think they know, but actually they don't. So the faces light up. Oh, it wasn't like that, it was like this. Oh, I get that, that makes sense. So it connects quite nicely. So that's quite a highlight, is the fact that I go away feeling as though I've given something and that they've got something. So that, I guess that's a highlight, yeah.
Perfect. What cultural differences have you noticed between the people in the different cities in the Proper Belt?
Well, they're all very, very different. I mean, Hong Kong is very different to Macau, and Macau is very different to Canton. And then you go into the smaller towns, certainly in the West River, there are connections between all of these, and obviously language and kinship and family links. It's a very hard thing to answer, because the backgrounds of them are all very different. Canton really is the primate city, to use the geographical term. The eastern terminus, the maritime silk route, with an economic importance that goes back to the Tang dynasty. In fact, it goes back earlier than that, because the Latin name for China is Serica, which is also the word for silk in Latin. So, of course, it all came through from Canton. So there's a great deal of interest just 80 miles up the river there. Macau, 40 miles away, now that has a European and indeed Japanese and Malaccan heritage, and the thing with Macau is it's very, very much a world place, because it links us into Southeast Asia, to the Trans-Pacific trade, to Europe, to early connections with Japan in the 17th century, so there's a huge amount there. And then we get down to Hong Kong, which was really the Liverpool of Canton, and you can really see it in that way. If we see in the Cantonese world, Canton was London, Hong Kong was Liverpool, in the sense of being a port or provincial place related to a closer metropolitan in every way. So they're very different. So yes, what cultural differences? Well, huge.
Are there any tips for the young writers on writing fiction and non-fiction you could share with
Well,
them today?
fiction is not something that I've written, though. That being said, if you write anything vaguely memoir-like, I mean, they always tend to say that autobiography is fiction. I suppose there's a truth in that. I tend to wander myself in some of my own writing, so whether people choose to believe all of that or not, it's up to them. Tips. The main thing I would suggest is don't give up on it. If you want to do something, then do it. Proceed with it. Find a way forward, and eventually you will. I mean, I look at my own career path, if I parenthetically career path, it's been relatively successful. And at least in part it's because I decided that I would do what I wanted to do. And so I've continued to do it. So I guess that would be a tip for someone younger. You don't have to go off and be a lawyer or a banker or something else. And in fact, a story I will relate to that which might explain it. And I related this one again when I was in Central this morning. If you go into Central, there's a statue in Statue Square of a frock-coated Victorian banker called Sir Thomas Jackson. And everyone who walks around in Statue Square thinks that that's the statue of Statue Square, but actually it isn't. The original statue is one of Queen Victoria. But Jackson is of interest, and it relates to writing. And how does that come together? Jackson was in Hong Kong for 30-odd years, and then he retired and was with the Hong Kong Bank office in London, training young bank trainees to come out to the Far East. And there was one young man who was being trained as a banker. The father was in Hong Kong in the government, and the brother was already here in the police. And this young chap was destined to be a banker, and but he didn't like banking, and he didn't particularly like the boss, and he didn't enjoy it at all. And he started writing short stories, and he wrote a few and freelanced them and did reasonably well and was published in Blackwoods and a few other magazines. So he kept on going, and eventually decided that he probably would be better off as a writer instead of a banker. So he stopped being a banker and became a full-time writer, and it's just as well that he did, because that was P.G. Wodehouse. So the thing with this, and it's what I always say to particularly younger friends, is you don't have to be a banker, you don't have to be a lawyer, you can go off and do what you want to do and look at P.G. Wodehouse. And then they look at me and scratch their head and say, well, who is P.G. Wodehouse? And I get annoyed and throw them a couple of books and say, read that and enjoy it and learn and laugh. And they smile and say, yes, Jason, well, there we are. But yes, so that would be my advice, that if you feel you're good at something, unless you really are comprehensively proven not to be, I will never be a threat in terms of boxing to Cassius Clay, but I enjoy it, that's fine. Keep going. That would be my advice.
That's great advice. Well, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Jason.
Not at all.
I was just wondering if you
Thank you
had
for asking me.
Did you have any parting words for our students, maybe where they could buy books?
Oh, my books. Oh, these ones here. I don't recommend them to anybody, but if you did want to read them, that's being self-deprecating. They're available in local bookshops, and there are a few others that are in process, and there will be another one out earlier next year.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed. Thank you.